My name is Jonathan Leger, and my path from cult survivor to crypto trader to Bitcoiner taught me the things I needed to know about sound money and showed me how desperately the world is in need of it. Today we're going to talk about whether or not the US government is a Ponzi scheme, because it's referred to as a Ponzi scheme by many Bitcoiners. Bernie Madoff famously referred to the US government as a Ponzi scheme, and I guess it takes one to know one. So let's talk about it. I've teamed up with the Konsensus Network, a Bitcoin-only enterprise which publishes and translates books about Bitcoin from a variety of respected Bitcoin educators. The link to Konsensus is in the video description, and if you decide to make a purchase, you'll be supporting this channel as I receive a small percentage of each sale. Thank you in advance for your support. This is my Substack, where I write articles about Bitcoin and I discuss them in these videos. The article that I'm going to discuss today is called, "Is the US Government a Ponzi Scheme?" No, it's much worse than that. So let's get right into it. A Ponzi scheme is a form of fraud that pays profits to early investors with money invested by more recent investors. Peter is robbed to pay Paul. The US government engages in Ponzi-like behavior when it pays off its investors, people who buy its treasuries, its debt, with the money it raises from new investors in treasury sales. This same behavior applies to all governments with debt denominated in their own currency. But for the sake of this discussion, we'll stick with the US, since it's by far the worst offender. The scale at which the US government has been doing this is staggering, with its deficit currently at around $30 trillion. Yeah, that's with a T. The government keeps issuing new debt to pay off its old debt. It's like you getting a credit card to pay for things you can't afford, maxing out your card limit, getting a second card with a higher limit to pay off the first one, maxing that one out too, and then getting a loan to pay off the second card, and then repeating that process for as long as you can afford the payments on the loan. That last bit, the payments, is why the US government is actually much worse than a Ponzi, but we'll get to that. Despite the recycling of its debt, the US government doesn't actually fit the legal definition of a Ponzi scheme. Paying off previous investors with money from new investors is only one required factor. To qualify as a Ponzi, the scheme must have little or no actual business activity that produces revenue. That would be like you not having a job or any income and going through the credit card to loan cycle I just described. With no revenue source, there's no way you can pay off the debt forever. Eventually, you would run out of money from the loan and you would be unable to make the payments. If you couldn't get another loan after maxing out the last one, you would have no choice but to default unless you could find a way to generate revenue and make the payments. Even if you did have an income source, the payments would still eventually get too large for you to sustain the debt cycle. It would just take longer. The US government generates an enormous amount of revenue by way of taxes, about $4.9 trillion per year as of the time of this video. You can think of that revenue as gross profit on the $25 trillion of sales that constitute the current gross domestic product, or GDP. It's not a perfect analogy, but it'll do. As the government takes out larger and larger amounts of debt to pay for things in its budget that it can't afford, the payments it must make on that debt grow too, taking up an ever larger chunk of the country's profit, its taxes. This isn't sustainable since the debt payments are growing at a faster rate than the income from taxes. But although paying off debt with more debt may be a poor business practice that inevitably ends in a debt spiral and default, it's not a Ponzi scheme if it's done by a legitimate business with a revenue stream. A Ponzi also generally involves the promise of large, unrealistic returns on the investment, often in a short period of time. U.S. Treasuries only pay a few percentage points in return, and it can take years to see that return, so the promise doesn't really qualify as a Ponzi. The term Ponzi scheme came from a famous fraud committed in 1920 by Charles Ponzi, an Italian immigrant to the United States. He began his fraud with a legitimate business idea, arbitraging the cost difference between foreign and domestic postage coupons. Ponzi didn't actually purchase or sell the coupons, though. He just took investors' money and paid off previous investors with the new money. The scheme lasted for less than a year before it fell apart, resulting in tens of millions of dollars of fraud in today's terms. That famous fraud illustrates the difference. Ponzi claimed to have a legitimate business, but he didn't. There was no product and there was no revenue. He was simply siphoning money off new investors as he paid off the previous ones. The The U.S. government does have a business, the economy, with a revenue source, taxes. It's spending more money than it takes in, which is why it takes on the debt, but there is revenue generation involved. Ponzi scheme must constantly find more willing people to dupe in order to persist. If people used good sense and thought about what was being promised, they wouldn't invest. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. The people approached with the scheme have a choice to refuse to participate, but greed causes them to ignore the red flags and invest in the hope of quick, outsized gains. The Ponzi takes two wrongs to work: the lies of the perpetrator and the greed of the targets. What the U.S. government does is, in fact, much worse than that. It doesn't rely on the greed of potential investors to scam for revenue, and the people it scams are not willing participants who had a choice not to participate. It steals the money from everyone holding U.S. dollars. Unlike a person or a business, the U.S. doesn't go to a bank and ask for a loan. It issues its own debt in the form of treasuries. If there aren't enough buyers, the Federal Reserve buys the debt. But the Federal Reserve is essentially part of the government, not in structure, but in behavior. So the government is basically buying the debt from itself. If that sounds ridiculous, that's because it is. But it's also theft. Every time the government issues debt, it creates new money, more dollars. Every time a new dollar is created, it reduces the value of all the other dollars. That's because dollars are just a representation of work. Trading work for work in a bartering system is very difficult and cumbersome. Imagine you grow oranges but need to buy a house. You can't trade that many oranges for a house. They would rot before the seller could eat them all. That's why we use money to represent work. It's much easier to trade for goods and services. To explain the theft the government is committing, imagine that there were only $1,000 in circulation, representing 1,000 hours of work done by the citizens. Each hour of work is worth $1. You're a hard worker and have managed to save $10. 10 hours worth of your time, your work. Now imagine the government issues $1,000 worth of treasuries in order to fund a war. There's still only 1,000 hours of work available, but now there's $2,000 in existence. It now takes $2 to represent 1 hour of work instead of just $1. Over time, prices of goods and services will readjust to reflect the new money supply, meaning the $10 you saved can only buy what $5 would have bought before the government created the new money. The government effectively stole 5 hours of your work, half your savings buying power, and gave it to themselves to fight a war without your permission. That's a very simplified illustration, but you get the idea. Creating new money in this way amounts to an unlegislated tax. Normal people call taking something that doesn't belong to you without permission theft. The government calls it inflation. The U.S. could cut spending or raise taxes to cover its bills, but it doesn't do that. Taxes are unpopular, as are spending cuts, so the government takes the easy path and picks the pockets of everyone holding U.S. dollars, both here and abroad. While Ponzi schemes only steal from the people that fall for the pitch, government money printing steals from literally everyone holding any of that government's currency. When Ponzi schemes are discovered or collapse under their own inability to find new investors, at least some of the money is usually restored to the investors. For example, in the case of Bernie Madoff, more than 80% of the money he swindled was recouped. You will never see a dime of the money the government has stolen from you through inflation caused by money printing. Bitcoin prevents the theft caused by money printing. Because it's decentralized, no individual, group, or country can create a new money without new work. If you want to create more Bitcoin, you have to mine it, which requires a large amount of electricity to run powerful computers that perform the mining. The Bitcoin network also self-adjusts to make sure that the inflation rate stays relatively constant, preventing anyone from suddenly injecting a large amount of Bitcoin into the network and creating inflation spikes. There's no way to print trillions of Bitcoins out of thin air, the way the U.S. government did with dollars over the past few years, causing inflation to spike as it robbed all U.S. dollar holders. There has never been a time in history when those in charge of the money supply could be trusted not to debase and corrupt it for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. Bitcoin removes that temptation from people by removing the power to modify it without a wide consensus of everyone that will be affected by the change. History has taught humanity a hard lesson that resulted in the creation of the solution. That solution is Bitcoin, and it's time to start using it and do away with corruptible fiat money. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you like this video, be sure to click like. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time.